one of the commentators that was reviewing the results of the survey attributed the decline of U.S. competitiveness to the byproducts of the economic crisis that we've been through, and that our institutions have been severely weakened as a result of the economic crisis. So a lot of these issues play into how viable public-private partnerships are going to be. And we have two outstanding and distinguished guests to talk about all of that stuff, with a particular focus on the healthcare and the financial area, where a lot of the current administration's transformational policies have been focused. So we're going to have a video first because, unfortunately, Susan Blessner was not able to be with us today. I'll just read you briefly her biographical background because it wasn't in the program. She is the Director of Corporate Accountability at Novo Nordisk, which is a pharmaceutical company. It's based in Denmark, and she is responsible for integrated reporting and business ethics strategy. And before moving to Novo Nordisk in 2008, she was responsible in her previous post for integrating financial and sustainability reporting at the private sector arm of the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, in an effort to model good sustainability management for the World Bank's private sector clients. She has a personal association with Jen and with George Washington University. She got her BA in economics as well as an MBA here, and she's currently pursuing a PhD in CSR at the University of Nottingham, for those Brits that are with us. And then, of course, I'll introduce Duane after we play Susan's video. So it's about 10 minutes, and she has prepared this little talk for all of us. So here we go.
Oh no,
It's not, okay. I just did the wrong one.
That's all right. I'm just, no value. Why is there, can you help out?
On the screen. And Jen unfortunately went out. What did she say?
This is not a research discussion. Rather, the purpose of this session is to talk about the topic of, given what we've been discussing about the difficulties of defining corporate social responsibility over the last couple of days, and we've had a couple of leading thought scholars, Ed Freeman and John Mahan, giving their views on that. And as Art was reminding us, the legitimacy of both governmental and corporate leadership is pretty questionable, low in the public opinion polls. I was asked to sort of take on the task of talking a little bit about integrating corporate and governmental responsibilities and focus these on sort of three current hot-button issues: risk management, systemic risk management, consumer protection, and executive compensation. And I guess I want to begin by explaining my viewpoint, because I think in addition to the problems we've talked about already, absence of legitimacy, profound disagreement about what is responsibility and where is it going. I think that the problem of how to integrate corporate and governmental responsibilities to move beyond the question of public-private partnership, which is only one option of how to do this, is that the theory of corporate social responsibilities and citizenship, which I'm not going to define in any practical terms until we get to active discussion, is caught between what I'll call a theory of crisis and reform. That is, we're basically lurching from one kind of a crisis to another. And lurching from a crisis to a crisis with alternative ways of reform, which involve deregulation and re-regulation, is a very awkward kind of a situation in which to operate. We're operating on emergency batteries in the first place. And in addition, we really don't have, I think, a theory of the allocation of responsibilities for certain critical things. So they're all listed here. I don't need to read these. In addition to the current financial crisis and its various components, we've got other difficulties layered on top of that. Problems of climate change and problems of healthcare reform. So there's a very open question as to whether we're talking about allocation of responsibility across sectors, including NGOs whose ethics might be questioned, and individuals, where does individual consumer responsibility end and start, for example, or whether what we have is a great deal of overlap in a confusing situation. So I think none of these are very well defined. But I think that we might begin to get a little insight into the basis of our problem if we just take a very simple new instance of a policy that's under consideration, introduced just this week by the chair of the SEC, talking to the Economic Club of New York. You may recall that back in May we had a crisis. This is a crisis in the stock exchange, in which everything suddenly plunged for no particularly good reason that anyone can identify. And one of the problems that's tied to that is a change in technology and procedure that permits what are called high-frequency trading, in addition to short selling and other kinds of things that happen in stock exchanges these days. So high frequency means basically there's so many trades nobody can keep up with it. And so the SEC is considering whether or not there ought to be a principle that says that traders with best access to markets have first responsibility, I'm going to translate the language, they have first responsibility to maintain liquidity. Which means to say they have to behave differently than they did in May when they were running for their lives to preserve themselves. They have some broader responsibility that we could call stakeholder responsibility or social responsibility, but it's a responsibility to maintain liquidity and not permit the market to plunge the way it did. And Shapiro's argument is, and also one of these would be whether or not you'd have to have a regulation that slows up stock quotations. So instead of moving almost instantly, they have to be maintained for a minimum period of time in order to slow up this kind of sudden plunge. And Shapiro's argument for your consideration is that when he had a manual market structure, the specialists and the dominant exchanges had assumptions of significant trading obligations that have disappeared with technological innovation. So something happened in the technology that has altered the sense of responsibility. And the question is now, to go back to the theme of our discussion, is whose obligation is it to restore market liquidity and keep it stabilized in the face of sudden events? Does it belong to the government? Does it belong to the private parties? Is it an interaction among the two? And then I guess in addition, is it an obligation at all? How do we evaluate these things? Well, that's a set of issues in kind of a nutshell that hasn't been resolved here. And to add to the excitement, I'm going to bring some new, very latest research coming out in front of you. We have all kinds of opportunities for securitization. If you thought it was over with mortgage-backed securities, you ain't seen nothing yet. Okay, all kinds of things are coming. So, for example, we could securitize automobile insurance policy holdings. And the interesting question buried in this and the research that's being addressed by these two scholars is whether or not that's a gain in efficiency and a gain in stabilization of certain kinds of risk management markets. And the point I'm making is we don't even know very much about how these things work, whether on the government side or the corporate side, as we try and figure out what to do with new innovations. Well, so that's sort of the starting point. And what we have, interestingly, for purposes of our discussion, is a natural experiment. We've just been through a natural experiment called the financial crisis. So it's been a crisis followed by a reform measure, which is the Dodd-Frank Act. And to make sure you know what the act is about, the full title of this act is as crystal clear as they could figure out how to write it. So here's all the things we're going to try and accomplish. And what I highlighted here is the various titles that deal with, first titles 1 and 5, systemic risk management. Title X has to do with executive compensation. It's actually buried down inside that title. And titles, I'm sorry, the 9th title, titles X and 14 have to do with consumer financial protection and mortgage reform. And an important thing to remember about government is there is no such thing as the government. The government itself is subdivided in various ways, and there's an allocation of responsibilities and tasks within the federal government for all of this. A law firm, Davis, Polk & Wardwell, has published an estimate of what the statute, which has not been fleshed out in any details, as was mentioned earlier today. It's just now it's on the books. We have to make it work. They suggest that there'll be 243 rules, 67 one-time studies, and 22 periodic reports that are embedded within the statute. So the point is, that's going to make it fairly difficult for us to test this natural experiment up the road. There's an awful lot going on. We live in a complex, chaotic world. Well, let's see. Gordon Gekko is getting out of prison shortly, as you probably all know, and he's got to get up to speed with this new technology stuff. Jeff Skilling is staying in jail. The Fifth Circuit's not letting him out on bail because he's still guilty of at least one crime that has nothing to do with honest services. So if we go and ask to various parties who were prime movers in the recent financial crisis, it shouldn't be surprising to just figure out what their testimony is too high, as it's going to say. So at Bear Stearns, their explanation is they were collapsed by short sellers. That if people had not been betting against them, they'd have been able to do things better. It turns out, of course, their leverage was extraordinarily high. There was a voluntary SEC program that didn't work. And the firm failed to forecast that there was a thing called a housing price collapse that was coming, even though John Paulson was, I thought, pretty clear most of the time what he thought about the matter. It was a disagreement of forecasting. Richard Fould, who used to head up Lehman, testified recently. And his argument was that we were collapsed by uncontrollable market forces, and the government could have rescued us if they wanted to, even though we made a lot of bad bets, because we couldn't forecast the collapse coming in the housing price market. Ben Bernanke has testified that he doesn't agree that it would have been possible to save them. So the thing I want to draw your attention to is, in my view, what's embedded in this is sort of a problem that goes back into the guts of corporate social responsibility theory. As Ezra Klein, a columnist, argues, they spend a lot of their time in this testimony proving they didn't do anything illegal so that they don't join Jeff Skilling in the next cell at the slammer, or take his over when he gets vacated, whichever cell is open first. And that is not the same thing as the ordinary meaning of doing right and wrong. I personally have very simple views of corporate social responsibility, not saying it's right or wrong, but you're irresponsible if you disobey the law and you do things you know are intentionally wrong. That doesn't make you responsible, but it makes you irresponsible. If you meet that minimum standard, responsibility is probably to be engaged by the fact that you try to do something good. Now, whether you wind up doing it is subject to all the complexity problems that we had talked about earlier. It's a very simple working definition, and then we don't actually know what the limits are of the specifics of this. A problem in talking both about corporations and governments is the wide range of possibilities for misconduct and mistake. It's not like there's something simple to go in and fix. It'd be nice if everybody were honorable, decent, etc., but not everyone is that way. And it turns out there's a huge range of things that can go wrong. So as I said, I think we're in some sense stumbling from one crisis to another. And the crises appear to be getting bigger. That doesn't mean it's a cycle. I don't know anything about cycle theory. But it appears to be that we're stumbling from one crisis to another. Goldman Sachs was fined a fair amount of money over the Abacus event, but that's virtually nothing compared to their profitability. And they don't admit that they did anything wrong. So my point is, a fine, unless the fine destroys the company, may not have much of an effect. Even the BP fund that they're creating would not necessarily be enough to collapse the company. Dell is located in Texas, and Dell has agreed to pay $100 million to settle SEC claims of fraudulent accounting. They were apparently trying to meet earnings targets while taking exclusivity payments from Intel without fully reporting it to the investor. What they meant is they were getting money off the books to basically work with Intel and not consider other vendors of the internal components of their computers. And the complaint here is they didn't fully report it. Sometimes behavior is simply run by the juvenile emotions of managers. So there's been a fine by the CFTC because a ConAgra trade group trader deliberately executed a futures contract at $100 a barrel, ignoring the market simply because he wanted to be first. So that's a difficult kind of a thing to regulate. Okay, so that's sort of the basics. Now let me get to the main themes. That is, a problem now in talking about how to define and then attempt to integrate corporate and governmental responsibilities is we may not have the slightest idea what we're doing. So, for example, Professor Murdoch's at the Loyola University Law School, and he has published an appraisal of the Dodd-Frank Act, Just Act, out that we haven't executed at all. And he says his view of that act is it's a marvelous instrument for making sure that what happened last time doesn't happen next time. But it won't do anything to fix the next problem that we cannot forecast. Because of the behavior of the way everyone acts, new innovations will come along that might be just as dangerous, or even more dangerous than the ones we've just been through, and that the fundamentals are management incentives that lead to excessive risk-taking, and basically financial power is getting aggregated, which makes the entire system unstable, dangerous, and prone to defect, collapse, failure, you name it. I don't know whether he's right or not, we haven't tested it, but at least want you thinking about that problem. That we have rearward-looking regulation and not forward-looking analysis. We'll see how that works. Representative Frank has said we're going to investigate this fall, presumably before the elections play out. Executive pay, because he's unhappy with how that has been handled. An interesting question is whether we know anything about executive compensation at all. That is, we may know that certain forms of compensation are bad. It's not clear, according to Lorsch and Karan at Harvard Business School, that we know anything about what makes pay good. So yesterday, Ed Friedman suggested that maybe we ought to incentivize managers across a broad array of performances for various kinds of stakeholders. I'm sympathetic with that, until we run into the fundamental problem of it costs the investors to benefit the consumers. How do we resolve the incentive issue unless it's a value or strategy for the company? Because if we haven't resolved those, then we can't actually figure out how to incentivize the managers. So there's certain things we have to do ahead of time. So we don't know much about systemic risk management. We don't know much about pay incentivization. And in addition, according to some other specialists, it's not even clear that we know what happened in the financial crisis. I mean, I'll give you a quick working model, but it's not clear that we know what happened with respect to systemic risk. The reason for that is, in effect, as Alan Greenspan testified about 2 years ago now, he was in a state of shocked disbelief because he thought risk was randomly distributed. That's a translation of the technical talk. The risk gets created, it gets randomly distributed. Therefore, if any piece of it fails, it can't propagate throughout the system faster than the fiscal and monetary authorities can react. There's no reason to believe that his belief is correct. What he was anchoring his testimony on is it ain't going to happen again. That's contrary to my suspicions that we're going to get new innovations that might even be more dangerous than the one we've got. So I'll let you weigh that. That's what it's for. Right? We can create a stylized model. I've got one here of roughly what we think happened, which is that we had a subprime mortgage bubble with collateral overvaluation. That's fancy language for saying everybody thought housing prices were going to continue to go up and you couldn't make a mistake. We have very strange ethics in corporations. We don't need BP, we don't need Shell, we only need Countrywide. Very strange sense of ethics, which precipitated propagation of a basic failure of the financial and monetary sectors of the economy in various kinds of ways, leading to a credit freeze, and thank you to the Europeans for having fouled up their sovereign debt situation. To layer all of that on top of it. So basically, we may have avoided the Great Depression. The president was just speaking this week. That's basically his argument. We may have avoided the Great Depression by various kinds of measures. What I'm suggesting is, in addition to the problem of strange ethics in corporations we've been talking about, it's not clear that government regulation is actually very good. I'm not here to talk about that in detail. But a perfect storm has the characteristics of everybody's a foul up. And we could have additional waves of new problems for which reforms do not necessarily accomplish much because they look backward. So an interesting thing in some respects, to draw a bottom line to this, is a lot of what's going to happen depends on who's in a strategic position. Who is a CEO and what do they value? And therefore we can have influence over that by how we educate people. Who is in a government position and has some good feel? We may have been very lucky that Bernanke was head of the Fed and Romer was head of the Council of Economic Advisors. They're both depression specialists. So they had a sense that if you screwed up, it could be really much worse than people were willing to talk about. Now we're in a sort of a general condition of stagflation. I'm going to finish up with just a couple of slides here because Professor Carnaghi's name has been mentioned already previously for a either notorious or I wonder what's going on article in the Wall Street Journal to lay out the case against corporate social responsibility. He explains the case here, which basically is either profits and public interests are aligned, so why do you need to worry about it? The market will operate. Or if they're opposed to each other, you can't expect an executive voluntarily to act in the public interest. It would, however, I think, be wrong to read Professor Carnaghi as saying the market's the only thing that matters. He goes on in the article to say that means you need all kinds of institutional safeguards, which includes government regulation, NGOs, and corporate self-control. That is, there has to be someone with values, enlightened insight, whatever it is going to be, running the corporation and running government positions. That's a different view from Howard Putnam, who was former CEO of Southwest Airlines, whose basically, his basic argument is you ought to forget about calculation and just remember ethics and integrity are the greatest asset you can have, and you've got to make up your mind about that question. You either believe that or you don't. I presume Mark Hurd doesn't actually believe that story. But it doesn't appear that he's very much punished. He's out one place, but in at another, which is sort of the market solution. The other problem we've got, in addition to competing views of corporate social responsibility, is in some sense we actually have competing views of what we mean by a market economy. I don't mean our views versus German social economy or Japanese closely guided relationships or what they may be doing in Switzerland or Austria or someplace. I mean, we ourselves do not agree on what we mean by a market economy. So it's very common to argue that the goal of the corporation is to add value to the stockholders or that the purpose of the corporation has to be broader than that. It's not even, in fact, established in one of the leading corporate finance textbooks that's widely used that the notion of the goal of the corporation is stockholder value maximization is anything more than vague. That's not actually what's argued in a finance textbook. Normally, it's the case that that's what managers and investors are trying to do, but you can't actually rely on the managers to solve the agency problem. And typically what managers are really doing is maximizing corporate wealth, which is under their control. And everybody understands that strategically you may have to consider stakeholders. So the notion that there's a debate about the goal is not much more than a modeling assumption to make an academic article simple. That's not what the textbook actually says. Everybody realizes it's more complicated. And a very recent paper by some economists, you may recognize Adam Smith, not the old one, the younger, basically argues that if you try and talk about this problem by attributing the causes to either market failure or political failure, that it must have been the market, it must have been the government, you're missing a very important point, which is a modern market economy is so intertangled and interwoven in a complex cause and effect sense that we're not going to get meaningful allocation of cause, and therefore we're not going to get meaningful allocation of responsibility. It's a big screw up, and everybody needs to grab a bucket and start pouring out of the boat before it goes under, and then figure out how to sort things. That all depends upon your sense of values and what you think is important. So I think that leaves us with the consumer protection part, which I haven't talked about much, mostly because we don't know much about it yet. There is a Consumer Protection Bureau for years in the Federal Trade Commission. We've now got a new Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. We've been trying for the last couple of years to rescue the mortgage situation. And yet just recently the report was that nearly half of the homeowners who enrolled in the mortgage relief program fell out. And we're having more and more homes falling into foreclosure, which means not much is working. And as a result, some economists are now beginning to talk of just letting the housing market fail because we can't salvage it. Let everything sort out and then work from there up. I'm not an aficionado of that view, but I think I ought to at least explain to you where the reasoning is going. Okay, how are we doing on time?
Well, why don't we try the video, and we can, unless anybody has any
Because
questions.
I'm basically finished with what I'm going to say.
And then we can open it up for discussion after the...
Right, we can come back. Let's see if we can make the video work.
See if we can get the technical.
And,
let me ask you a question while we're waiting for that.
And I'm answering all questions for Susan, so.
You know, the free market system, one of the beauties of it is that it's built, especially in the financial sector, built on confidence and consensus. And you've got a very interesting dynamic of interplay when you've got an administration that's doing so much of a push on what many would argue is transformational regulation during this period. So how critical is at this juncture with everything that's going on with the financial reform, how critical is corporate consensus to making all of this actually work to mend the system? Because you hear a lot of analysts talking about the fact that many of the corporations are sitting on piles of cash, and they're not hiring because they're not confident about where the tax picture is going to look.
Right. So let's throw trust away.
Okay.
The trust is, to me, a personal kind of relationship. I may trust my stockbroker, but that's because we went to college together. And I don't necessarily trust him fully with my money because he can make mistakes. That's trust. What we're talking about here is confidence. And so, yes, problems would be solved more quickly if there was a consensus among the government and major business leaders to put money to work. In a market economy, the general problem, Keynes called this a liquidity trap in general terms of the Depression, is everyone acts to safeguard their individual interests. So households are piling up cash savings. Now, it's not like huge, but relative to the normal operating reserves, they're like triple. Corporations are piling up cash. When liquidity was pumped into banks, they went out and bought other banks, not putting the money to work. So yes, money would go to work sooner if there was collaboration to undertake to make the country work. In effect, in practice, what everyone's waiting for is the government to act first. It's a first mover question in a complicated multi-party game. And nobody's going to have confidence about this until the economy begins to pick up and to begin to move. So everyone's worried that the monetary authorities have run out of things to do. I myself don't have that concern because they haven't started to print money in the conventional sense. So there's still things they can do. But yeah, and then the question is, are we running out of fiscal stimulus because there's too much debt? So people are all talking about this. Nobody's talking about, should we have a big conference, get together, talk over the interests of the country, and just get together. There's been a big technological change. In a prior crisis, J.P. Morgan just locked everyone in a room and said, nobody gets out of the room until you pledge enough money to protect the economy. Right? There's no such actor. The president can't do that. There's been a big series of changes. This would be my answer. Are we ready?
Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry for the Song and Dance Act. We're covering for the technology.
All right. So Susan.
To link to what I had said before about simple definitions of business ethics, legal compliance, and social responsibility. So if we assume that there's no evidence that this company is doing something wrong, so they're not violating the law, they're not doing anything that is recognizably wrong, then presumably what they're trying to work out in the triple bottom line is the best combination of profit and contribution of good to various parties that they can. Going back to John Mann's observations, in some respects that has to be left to the company for local option within circumstances to decide how to do that. And one could say positively in their orientation that they are making efforts from the report to improve information, improve its transparency and dissemination, and to move this into the core of the company. That's sort of what I got out of it myself to tie to my observations. So, Mark, did you?
Anybody else want to add to that? Or questions?
I've just done some observation, but I think it was a great presentation. It's the corporate responsibility and business ethics being integrated. There's an effort to integrate the ethics and integrity into the business processes. That's very good about it. Article of association is one thing which is unique. I don't know how many other American companies are also trying to get the ethics and the responsibility inducted into the article of association. In our own company, in Tata Steel, we have endeavored to put it as a clause in our article of association. That means the corporate social responsibility is not an optional endeavor; it's something integral to the business. And for the sake of successive generation of leadership to comply with the same ethos, it has that value. The strong value goes across the generations. And incidentally, Professor, I'd like to share with you, we inducted this article of association in 1970, the very same time when Milton Friedman talked about one stakeholder, only the shareholder being the stakeholder in the company. So that is the time we promoted this idea of multi-stakeholderism as integral to our business. So I think I find some similarity in our business ethos and what Susan has talked about.
And I can't undertake to speak for Ed Friedman, who's not here,
yeah.
But my understanding of his recent work, no, I can't do it. So my understanding of some of his recent body of work on entrepreneurial value creation is that a company that undertakes to properly understand value creation for all of its stakeholders, it seems to me that these are models that align with that view. That you've just expressed and is expressed at No. Okay.
I think we're done.
I think
Well, questions for
you.
me? What time are we supposed to finish?
whenever we're done with the questions, we'll just take a break.
No, there has to be.
Yeah, there is a time, but.
Okay, so.
Any questions?
Any questions?
Any questions or comments?
Any questions?
Ready for
comments
coffee.
Duane?
Been desperate for
Everybody's in complete agreement.
David?
Yeah, I thought that these two presentations work well together because there you have an individual company, an actor in the market, trying to synthesize and bring together these values and operationalize them. If it was a family business and owned by a family, the family would do it. They'd sit down on a Friday night like they did at Levi's and decide these issues. But if you're a publicly held business, you have to have a system to make it happen. But then Duane's presentation is great because it shows the weakness of that. Because if you have a whole bunch of people, whether they're responsible or not, heading off like the gathering swine in the wrong direction, the system fails. So one of the weaknesses of the kind of corporate citizenship argument is it does focus on individual agents of the market, but there are occasions when the whole market is so badly skewed that we end up with either financial or social or environmental disaster.
Yeah, I had suggested that there is embedded in our area of discussion a kind of levels of analysis problem to where we assign causality. So if we take Tata and Novo to be good examples of what we want, why is all of this missing in the Wall Street industry? What is contextually unusual about Goldman Sachs or Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers? Is it them, or is it something more complicated? So in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith has basically a diatribe against the Honorable East India Company.
Absolutely.
He's got a diatribe against everybody else, including all his academic colleagues.
Well, he hates the company.
He hates the diatribe about everybody, but he dislikes the company. But I thought buried in that was an interesting observation to remember. He said, no one should read my complaints against this company and its personnel as personal attacks upon them. everyone should remind themselves of the question, how would I have conducted myself if I were in their shoes? That's a levels of analysis problem, from separating individual from organization, from system, from opportunity, from government. And you have to sort of, I think, tease all of those out to know what your analysis is. I know what I think is a good company and industry, and I know what I think is a bad one, but that's then a definition of pornography. It's not a theory, but I can recognize good and bad. I think he was waiting.
I got a question. It's not something I've ever thought about. For those of you who sort of look at companies and assess, think about, are they socially responsible? With regard to Goldman Sachs and other actors on Wall Street, you say, well, you know, why aren't they? So my question is, who in the corporate world uses them? And do you assess those in the corporate world that use them in some way based on their being a part of their supply chain, so to speak? So if there's a good actor socially in the corporate world, do you in any way say, well, geez, you can't really be a good actor if you're working with those guys? Or that means you're really not such a good actor? We tend to look at environmental, you know, at pollution, and we tend to look at, you know, treatment of employees or people in the community, but do you really go upstream and say, well, Jesus, look at the sons of bitches you're dealing with on the high financial level?
I think we have to work out first, in my view, in each instance of a thing, an action or an inaction, we have to work out the basis on whether we decide that it's right or wrong. There has to be a standard for that. So in Goldman Sachs' case, they've settled, that in effect they settled out of court without admitting specific guilt. And one of the things that's happened in the recent crisis is Goldman Sachs has actually been performing better financially as their competitors sort of collapse away. And their line of defense would be that they were selling abacus, whatever it is, CDOs, is very complicated kind of construction. They were selling them to sophisticated investors, for which there's a legal loophole. I guess my view is their defense is not sufficient morally, because some of the buyers are German banks. I've got reasons to wonder whether or not they should actually fit the notion of a sophisticated investor. And buried inside Goldman Sachs abacus is the simple problem of the violin and its valuation. John Paulson made no secret of the fact he was hand-picking what he thought would be a portfolio guaranteed to fail. And he's putting a price on that, but then the question is, how much of that was really explained to the specialized investors? Well, it's not going to be worked out in a trial with lots of testimony because it's set. So my general point is, for any specific incident, issue, action, inaction, to follow up on Ed Freeman's notion of responsibility for effects, we first have to decide what the motive is, the action is, the outcome is, and then make a judgment about whether we think it is right or wrong. And in ethics, that's independent of whether it's legally correct or not.
I want to make a point also, too, that I think there's another parallel big picture question here, which is the role of strategic leadership and the CEOs. And I would argue, and a lot of people have argued, that culture has played a big piece in a lot of the change in organizational behavior that allowed companies to get away with certain things, that allowed BP to engender a groupthink, top-down, command and control management style that set them up for having more of an appeasement approach to safety concerns. And it gets back to the era of the CEO celebrity that we celebrated so dramatically for the last 20 years, and the fallout of that, where CEOs were rock stars, and the value system that was supposed to be represented in some of these ethical practices went out the window because we were dazzled by the Jack Welches and others who, you know, Jack Welch is probably a good example of somebody who implemented an ethical code corporate-wide, but CEOs who, you know, sort of embodied in their singular leadership style what the company stood for. So if you had a CEO who was, kind of in the gray area of corporate ethics, then you engendered a culture that everybody fell in line. And that's the upside, and I think the downside to the American system is that we're collectively a group of individuals, but we often operate collectively and not necessarily individualistically within corporate structures. So I think that's part of the dilemma.
So I would characterize it this way: if you can't meet an agreed set of minimum standards, however we get to them, you're irresponsible. It's irresponsible. That you can meet the checkoff list doesn't make you responsible. So that, I think, is the problem at BP and at Goldman Sachs. They think of the world as a checkoff list of minimum requirements, and they think of legal or technical loopholes. You start looking for loopholes, there's something wrong with your value set. So I had a very simple view of that. Jen, were you finished? And
well, I guess I want to just go back and maybe follow up just a little bit. I'm thinking, my question, I'm thinking less of the buyers and sellers and these complicated mortgage and other transactions. I'm thinking of the large corporations that take advantage of Goldman Sachs investment advice. If you look at the list of companies that are part of the businesses for social responsibility, there are a lot of big dogs there. And I don't know if they use Goldman or not. Insofar as I know, none of them have stood up and said, given what we perceive to be bad behavior, we're not going to do business with that. The same way, if there were, if a supplier was a polluter, they might distance themselves from a polluter. So I guess I'm saying there are consumers of Goldman services who haven't spoken a word. Maybe I'm missing it. They're not speaking up, saying, Goldman, that's not okay. You lose our business if you behave.
Warren Buffett has said that acted in defense of Goldman Sachs publicly. Part of that is he owns shares in Goldman Sachs, and the value of that is dependent upon what happens to the CEO. I don't think it's, to me, what Goldman Sachs did in Abacus strikes me as wrong. That is, there's something that they did that doesn't seem right. Now, whether that's sufficient for us to invoke that other parties have to do this or have to do that, that's a step I don't know that I'm prepared to take. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying it's a thin beef in certain respects, but it is a beef.
I guess I would make an observation, I'm going to talk about it later, is I think in corporate social responsibility, consumers play a big role as to whether corporations are responsible. And
Yes.
consumers of Goldman services, and they're fine with it. So who are we not to be?
Well, it may just tell us something about the distribution of values and the strategic situations. So that's where I would leave it. Jen, you wanted to?
I would actually come back to what an earlier question, but it's trying to model some of these ideas in my mind, and my mind just isn't big enough, which is why I pulled all you in part. But if we talk about individual values and wrapped up in firms, wrapped up in industries, wrapped up in societies, or if you start to look at, so that's the levels of analysis sort of activity, then you've also got the firm within a government, within a society. Are these nested issues, or are these interactions?
I don't think it's clear. It's easiest to say they're interacting. It's not clear that they are nested or that they ought to be nested. That is either empirically or theoretically. A complication arises if the head of Goldman Sachs truly believes that an efficient market system creates welfare better than government intervention, and truly believes that a sophisticated investor should have known enough to be wary of the Abacus deal. I'm not saying, I don't know, to go back to a remark John, I don't know from his testimony whether he believes it truly or not. But if he truly believes it, if Jeff Skilling truly believes that they were innovative and improving welfare, that's a much more complicated problem to diagnose than lying, stealing, and cheating, as we say in Texas.
So it's a cool the
An
market.
unbranded herd is a lot more complicated than was the brand changed.
So is that a cooling off the mark sort of argument that, look here, not here, because I can get off or I can pursue other avenues by
I don't
attribution.
think when people are facing indictment and could go to prison, that you can expect them to give fully truthful testimony. The point I'm making, because that's a hard
So survival is a different argument.
But the point I'm making is you also must make a judgment as to whether they are lying. They could lie to us, or they could lie to themselves, or they could truly believe what they say. So finance specialists have been trained in business schools long enough that they tend to truly believe things. There are people who believe that insider trading should not be regulated because having insider trading is an efficiency gain in the stock market relative to the current apparatus. That argument could have some merit to it. Personally, I'm not buying a big change in stock market regulation because of an academic article that argues that there might be an efficiency gain. I've got reservations about that kind of big-scale alteration. You should remember people believe different things. And the first thing you have to sort out is what is the standard for who is or what is right or wrong. Right? And how do we do that in very specific cases? So a problem with very general abstract principles, like I said, business ethics, do no wrong, always obey the law, try and do some good. Okay, what does that have to do with this particular company, his particular company, Goldman Sachs, his company, etc., where you're dealing with the specifics of the matter?
So it's a threshold argument also.
It could be that there's
Start with the why and so.
Yeah, given a complicated problem, I tend to prefer simple definitions that I can work with. Is if I can't solve the complexity, let's start simple. Did they do something wrong? I think there's something wrong in the abacus arrangements. That is, somewhere there wasn't sufficiently full disclosure because anyone truly and fully informed of John Paulson's views is either got to take a contrary bet because they think better, or they didn't know enough to understand the bet they were making. It's a big difference between a roulette table that's lit and a fair, balanced spin with people just disagreeing about what the distribution is. And another one where somebody says, why don't you bet on 36? Because that's what they were offering. That's a strange offer to put forward when you expect 36 not to turn up. So I just go down to the simple, and not the sophisticated finance stuff, just very simple. What's wrong with what they were doing when their defense is it's sophisticated investor? Looks to me like they've got to amble around the world looking for investors who are not sufficiently sophisticated in order to entice them with that deal. But that's just me. There's
Right.
no
but I'm looking at something
That's another
different. But
ethical
okay, yeah.
All right,
I am
think
looking
we
at
should
something
call.
else.
Oh, we're over.
So thank you very much. Here we go. And last but certainly not least,
Looks like a crowded table.
it's a crowded table. It's a very crowded table.
You think? Ah, you're on the other end. Kind of good.
So last but certainly not least, let's look to the social as well as the environmental entrepreneurs. But let's look to entrepreneurs and small and medium businesses to see what it is that they can tell us if we relax that idea of medium scale. What is it that they do? What are their challenges? How is it that they're able to make a difference? And for those of you that haven't been with us, the norm is that we don't have name tags, so you're going to have to introduce yourself.
Okay.
And then the floor is yours. Other than that, there are really no rules.
Okay, great. Well, there are no rules, so the session's over. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
My name is George Solomon, and the fact that I'm an associate professor of management here at GW Teach Entrepreneurship. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Entrepreneurial Excellence, and I used to spend 30 years at the SBA designing programs in management technical assistance. So I'm not going to talk very much. I want our panelists to do all the talking. Our first panelist is Dan Simons, who's the head of or co-founded, I'm not going to try to spell this, but it's VSHG, and you'll know it best because he's one of the founders of Founding Farmers. And Founding Farmers and Fisheries?
Farmers and Fishers.
Fishers. So one of the things I told the first two presenters is to talk a little bit about their companies and how social responsibility and the double bottom line work, why it works, and why they think it's important. And so we'll start with Dan.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's always fun to participate and do this sort of thing and take the opportunity to learn a little bit and share a little bit. So my name's Dan Simons. I'm one of the founders and partners in Founding Farmers Restaurant, Farmers and Fishers Restaurant. Founding Farmers is a restaurant here at 20th and Pennsylvania, and then Farmers and Fishers is another restaurant we have in Georgetown at the waterfront. And that's just the operations side of our business. We have a consulting and development firm. We're small. We have 14 employees on the consulting side, and we develop restaurants for people, and we do, we have Fortune 500 clients, Fortune 100 clients, and itty-bitty, the tiniest, most micro clients imaginable. And we do all sorts of restaurant and hospitality consulting. So, my perspective on corporate social responsibility is, I think it's sort of a funny thing. Because it could only have been created by big corporations that don't care about those things. Because it's really, and Jen's probably heard me say it before, but companies should be really a reflection of the people that work in them. And I'm an optimist. I think human nature, in good societies, I think human nature is a really great thing. And I think most people are good, and I think people generally do good things. And money clearly colors all of that, and power colors all of that. So, for us, what it means is just, your face is on the business. Your name is on the business. You have to sleep well at night, and you have to meet other people and talk to them. And you're accountable and responsible for what your business does. So I think it's a shame in big corporate America when you can somehow hide behind that. And I think the answer comes from, the general public and investors need to look people in the eye. As a stockholder, you need to look the board of directors in the eye, and you need to communicate. And I think if that was really the stance, there's a huge opportunity for lots of great companies, big and little, to just do things where they see the company as a holistic part of the community and a holistic part of the planet. Because, at least what I believe, I don't get how you can see it any other way. I don't get how you can think your business is detached from the welfare of your people. I don't really get how you can be a CEO of a huge company that, doesn't care about the environment or doesn't care about its people, but yet you have children and they go to school and you poison the environment, but you don't care about your kids. So it's really hard for me to reconcile as a business person. So I chalk it all up to money, and weak character. And I think you have to have the courage to say that to people. And for me, it's easy. I can't get fired, right? I have my own company. I report to the board of directors. We have institutional investors. But our stance is we do it for the long term. And so, like at Founding Farmers, our investors are American family farmers. There is no more honorable group, and there is no group that thinks more for the long term. They just have the best perspective. And business is so easy with them. Because when you just talk about doing the right thing, they're farmers. Of course they do. The land matters, the planet matters, the workers matter, the quality of the food matters. And they see everything as this cycle. So, what we try to do in our company is consider our actions, and we have to make money. But there's some money we forego. There's some margin we don't squeeze. And I think we're able to do it. And, we've gone from having 2 employees to having 275 when you look at our companies together. And if you factor into your financial forecasts and your promises to your investors the things that you want to do and how you want to do them, then you can do those things. But in business, when you make promises and you don't factor in the cost of doing the right thing, then you're dead. So I think it's about foresight, financial planning, and character. And it's definitely easier when you're a little business because, I don't actually have gazillions of dollars at stake. So I get being a small enterprise is easier. And it helps you compete against the huge companies. Like in my business, the huge restaurant corporations, they're so vulnerable. They're so vulnerable to competition from the little guy because at times they are disingenuous. The ones who are genuine with what they do, I think with CSR stuff, are wildly powerful. And I think there are a lot, actually, of well-run big companies out there that are on board with this, but clearly still in the minority. So those are my thoughts.
Our next panelist is Elise Perez, who's a former student and friend. She's currently the general manager of Zipcars, the Greater Washington and Baltimore area.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, Zipcars is the world's largest car sharing service, and it's growing in many areas in many different directions. Prior to that, Elise was the managing director of K Club, where we used to talk to her boss, Warren Brown. She's got an MBA here from GW, and she got a BA from the University of Texas at Austin. So Elise has been in 2 entrepreneurial types of ventures, completely different, maybe different perspective on corporate hospitality.
Thank you. So, thank you guys for coming. This is actually interesting for us to discuss as well. I'm a former student from here as well, and these are my former professors, which is always nice to come back and visit these guys. So yes, so I'm the general manager for Zipcar. Any Zipcar members in the audience here? Very good. Feel free to bring out your Zip cards. I'd love to see those in the audience as well. Zipcar is the world's largest car sharing organization. So what we do is, our objective really is to reduce car ownership. And so just by the very nature of who we are and what we're doing, we're green. But it's an interesting balance, because basically what we're doing, the value proposition that we have for our members and our customers, is to make it very easy, very simple, and pretty cool to actually get rid of your car, and a lot less expensive than owning a car. So our value proposition is about convenience, simplicity, all those good things that every customer identifies with. And for a lot of customers, oh, by the way, it's very green. It's very green. For every one Zipcar we put on the road, we take 15 off the road. The average Zipcar member that sells their car and joins Zipcar saves $600 a month. So with all those things, then there's additional statistics like the average Zipcar member saves 219 gallons of gas a year after joining Zipcar. So all of those things are certainly appealing to a lot of individuals, but the masses enjoy the savings of dollars, right? Everyone enjoys that. I always joke, like, I wish I had a car to sell, because then I could save all that money. But I don't own a car, and I just use Zipcar for work and for business, for work and for personal all the time. So for us, it's actually, to like Dan's his points earlier, it's just ingrained in who we are. Yeah, it's a part of the service that we provide for our members. It's a part of the alliances that we have with the different partnerships that we have. So that would be with the municipalities here in DC. We have, you guys have ever seen the orange poles that we have all over town? And those are the places you never want to park. If you do, you get a $100 parking ticket, and this is through the alliance that we have with the DC government and with WMATA and with Arlington County and with Rockville. And so these the municipalities appreciate the results that we're achieving in reducing car ownership, which reduces congestion, which reduces pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we, just by the nature of who we are, we're a green company, and we're corporate socially responsible. So it's interesting though, but certainly as we are a for-profit company, right? And so what we're always looking at is trying to figure out how to manage the company and make money and continue to grow and expand. And I think it's actually, that's the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to be a for-profit company, because you can be very efficient in your endeavors, and that's what we're looking to do. So, but then in addition to the services that we provide, and the service that Zipcar is, we live it and breathe it internally as well. Most of our employees are Zipcar members. Every employee is a Zipcar member, but most of our employees don't own cars and just use Zipcar all the time, or just take the metro. I mean, I took the metro to come here. And it's by living and breathing it, to your point earlier, you believe it. And so when you're sitting up in front of a panel of folks that you actually believe in, are living and breathing and telling the real story. And so you can tell someone it's really easy to live without a car. Why would you? You don't drive a car 24/7, so why should you pay for it? So it's something that we really believe in, and I think we're pretty good at it.
Great. I think the point made by the first two presenters are that in running a small, growing entrepreneurial venture, the venture is in fact themselves. So it's difficult to separate the company did X when it's really I did X. Where major corporations, you'll talk to corporate executives and say, I work for the corporation, they make the decisions. You go, who are they? I'm not sure, but I work for them. So I mean, I'd agree with those decisions, but I'll still follow through with them. So what you get is a different kind of orientation, a kind of different commitment to social responsibility. Our third presenter, who's got some PowerPoints for us to see, is Tom Rawls, who's been with you all day, and is the sales and marketing at Native Energy. So let me get this. How's that?
Okay, and how do I drive this puppy?
You just click the clicker, or you can hit the turn key, enter key.
Okay, good. Well, Jen, thank you for inviting me up. I've been in the renewable energy and carbon space for more than a dozen years, and talked at a number of places. And for me, this isn't the usual suspects, so it's an enjoyable change. I'm going to run through. I'm going to power through some slides here. You get a sense of who the company is. I think as I describe what we do, I won't start. Just to be clear, I'm in sales and marketing, so I sell. Therefore, I am, with all due respect to Descartes. So I'm every day chasing revenue, more importantly, chasing margin. And what I'm selling, what our company sells, is a public good. So it's social responsibility isn't some kind of bolt-on to what we do. It's inherently what we are. It's, if you will, it's in the skeleton. What we're selling is less of something that you cannot see, you cannot smell, you cannot feel, you cannot taste, you cannot hear. So we're selling less of almost nothing. And so that has its challenges. We're in the business of selling carbon reductions. We get a carbon reduction. We sell it. A corporation uses it as an offset. We're mostly in the B2B business. These are voluntary markets. John had some questions about voluntary. I'm going to define voluntary here quickly for the purposes of my presentation only. So I don't want to take any of the fun away from John in future presentations he might make. But voluntary in this case means it's something that it's an act that's not required by law or regulation. So the motivation behind it, I don't know, but it's not required, and so what we're doing is we're selling reductions from projects that are created not because they're in any way mandated. So we're addressing greenhouse gases that would be sent in the air. Would be missed under any regulatory scheme. We're mostly selling to businesses, and I want to give you a little background on our business. The current state of the greenhouse gas. Al Gore, as the fire breather around climate change, has disappeared. Well, we've heard some things about where he may have disappeared too, but basically he did an exceptional job for a while in creating a lot of energy. Interest, a sense of urgency. He's not the only one, but he really was a major influencer in the voluntary markets. Al is AWOL now. The other thing is, you may recall the emails, over in Britain, the emails, and that, the advocates being petty in their email exchanges. What that really did was give the deniers who wanted to talk about junk science, which is what we see on the screen, it gave the deniers an opportunity to reinvigorate their discussions of this is all junk science. So you've lost a major advocate, you got people talking about junk science, and right in the middle of it you got Wall Street having screwed up on the housing market, and there's a significant segment of people who are saying these carbon things, that's just a scam for Wall Street to do the next housing. They're going to do derivatives. What's it mean? And so you've got right now in the world we're operating in some problematic influences. And we certainly see it in D.C. Nothing's going to happen in D.C. until some new champion steps up. Quickly, the U.S. voluntary carbon market. This is 2008. It's actually down slightly in 2009. It's a $300 million market. The compliance market under a cap and trade regime would be a 40, 50, 60 billion dollar market. You can see businesses. Can you see this slide? On the left, businesses far outstrip other buyers. Here's examples of buyers, and I want to slow down slightly here on this slide to touch on a couple of things. I show that these are our businesses, and if you look at people like Stonyfield, Ben and Jerry's, a lot of these guys are sort of early pioneers in the corporate social responsibility space. I'll go to Stonyfield just because I know Gary Hirschberg a little bit. Gary's their CEO. He was at New Alchemy Institute, and if you're if you're an old hippie, you'll know New Alchemy was on Cape Cod. It was an alternative agricultural alternative agricultural alternative energy experiment. Gary got into making yogurt, and now he's a CEO of a major corporation. And so for a guy like Gary, the CSR is sort of part of the DNA. I'm not so sure about Hilton. And the question is, do I care if it's in their DNA? Should we care if it's in their DNA? And my reaction is I don't care if it's in a company's DNA. I don't care if CSR is in their DNA, so to speak. And I don't really care what someone's motives are. I don't know anyone's motives. And if they were to tell me, I don't know if it's true. And if they were to tell me, I'm not sure they really know. I think motives are largely unknowable. Maybe Sigmund Freud could unravel them. So my view is it's all about what a company does. And my mantra, based on Gertrude Stein, is a good thing. A good thing is a good thing is a good thing. And what you'll see, certainly out of some of what I would refer to as the grassroots NGOs, is sometimes a good thing becomes bad because it isn't better. In my view, a good thing is always a good thing. And so I'm looking for people who act well. And we try and help them do that. That's sort of, if you will, our business. I think, John, commitments. I'm not interested in commitments. I mean, commitments are, commitments are like, they're just undergarments. They're sort of what you wear for show before the action really begins. I'm less interested in the commitment and more interested in what did they do. So what do we do? These are a couple other, if you look at the slides, these are a couple examples of other buyers and why. What do? We're in the business of originating projects that create greenhouse gas reductions. I put in red pollution. Greenhouse gases are pollutants. Everyone uses the term emissions. Used to be a journalist, and for me, language matters. And of course, emission is a much more neutral, gentler term. If you talk about greenhouse gas emissions, you're saying one thing. If you talk about pollution, you're saying something else happens in a person's mind. So we're involved in the business of developing projects, typically small projects, that reduce pollution. Our model, we call it Help Build. We bring upfront financing to projects, and it's, as our attorney says, it's better than equity. And that's because what we do is we buy the long-term stream of the carbon reductions. We pay for them once up front. Project doesn't have to wait until the reductions are produced to get paid. They get the money up front. They can get built. So that's sort of, that's the model we've created. We're about the only outfit doing that. We enable small projects to go forward. The big guys who are financing carbon reduction projects, the Goldman Sachs, they're not doing the kinds of projects we are. There's some concerns about the projects we do, and I won't get into all the details, but if you're interested, I can sort of get into that with you. For us, I guess I'm just going to go back. I talked about the intangible nature of what we sell. And that's a problem. So if you look at these things on the screen, the school turbine in Ray, Colorado, school district can put up a turbine because of our, in part because of our purchase of the carbon offsets. So that we take this ethereal notion, ephemeral notion, and we turn it into literal metal in the ground. So our customers really connect to an actual project. And that's sort of the value that we provide. Companies can look at a specific project and say, I helped make that happen. Without me, that project wouldn't be up. Those emissions wouldn't be avoided. That pollution wouldn't be avoided. There's another approach, the so-called performance standard. Again, this gets into kind of, takes you into the policy rabbit hole, and I'll spare you. It has some ease of administration over the model we use. And actually our model is at some risk. The regulatory paradox that we face is that legal standards in some ways, legal standards for carbon projects may be less exacting than the standards we currently follow. And so early movers like us could be at a disadvantage, and this falls under the category you've all heard of no good deed goes unpunished. And so this is a little bit of a concern we have where, in a sense, ease of moving projects into the pipeline sort of may trump what we think of as quality under a regulatory regime. I want to finally just touch on one last thing, and I raised it in my question to you about, you know, people who use Goldman Sachs services. It's the whole question of what's the role of the consumer in social responsibility? In my mind, we're selling to corporations. Some corporations, they're doing it for corporate purposes. Most of the people we sell to have a strong retail presence. And so the interest of the consumer in corporate behavior is a significant influencer. And what I see in the world in a dozen years is price is the ultimate virtue. For a responsible company, giving me a low price, that's the most important thing. Now, there are lots of studies out there about willingness to pay. I'm sure you guys in the academic world have looked at willingness to pay studies, and there's a kind of a high expressed willingness to pay and a relatively low low incidence of action. Oh yeah, I'll pay more. Not for that one, I won't. Now, there are lots of reasons why, but ultimately, you know, we heard the guy from Calvert, I don't think he's with us, say the CSR screen doesn't let Walmart through. Consumers will tell you, Walmart's responsive to me. They give me a low price. That's in some ways, you know, low price trumps. There's an expression I like that sort of captures this: is the tie goes to the dolphin, and this is the whole willingness to pay. You have 2 cans of tuna, and they're both the same price, and one's dolphin free. This dates back a little bit, and one isn't. If I don't have to pay more, okay, I'll buy the dolphin free tuna. If I got to pay more, I'm not so sure. So a lot of this willingness to pay, tie goes to the good guy, but it doesn't necessarily go to the most expensive guy if he's a better guy. That's what we're seeing in the marketplace. So I think the consumer plays an enormous role. I would point to the American automotive, whatever it was, meltdown. I saw Bill Ford IV, is it William Ford IV, whichever, Jr., when he took over, speaking before all corporate executives at Series, and he made this disparaging remark, self-disparaging remark about the Ford Explorer, which he jokingly referred to as the Ford Valdez. And everyone laughed and said, isn't that great, he can make fun of himself. Now, Ford, Ford's kind of an interesting, it seems to me, I don't know, kind of tension in there. On the one hand, is it the Rouge River plant, did I pronounce that right? But they got this manufacturing plant where they've done all kinds of hot shit stuff. They get William McDonough in, and I can't remember what they do, but it's so kind of state-of-the-art, socially responsible manufacturing facility. And they're making their money off big SUVs. Now, why are they making their money off big SUVs? Well, I think a lot of that's the consumer. So Ford, in my view, to some extent, socially responsible, you know, a lot of people don't think so, but without consumer demand for more responsible products, I think corporations to some extent are a little bit in a tough spot. I'd make one final observation for John. This is a friendly piece of consulting advice. If you came into our business and suggested we do an experiment, a little experiment, we wouldn't do that. As I said, I was a writer, so language matters. So if you went in and said do a pilot project, so businesses don't do experiments. It's just the research business, but they do pilot projects. So tuck that one in your consulting portfolio, and thank you.
All right, great. Our last presenter, panelist is Michael Olden, and Mike's going to be talking about founder director of the South Florida Green Drinks, a leading green networking organization working to position South Florida as a sustainable mega region. And it's going to set up. All you got to do is hit
As the last speaker that stands between all of us and the weekend, or the bar, or the reception, trying to make my case up here, and my introduction is probably not going to help. I'm a recovering lawyer, and I'm here to talk about going beyond compliance, which has got to be about the dullest subject that anybody thus far has talked about. And in fact, it was kind of difficult to prepare. It's trying to answer a question that sort of defies explanation. We've heard from Tom. The sale of carbon offsets into the voluntary market, your question ought to be, why would anybody pay for these if they don't have to? You know, what's in it for them? Well, the answer, at least for small and medium enterprise, I think would surprise you. So, to make my case, do we have at least one business student here? We have two. Do you have a dream job?
Me?
Or, any of our business students, do we have a dream job that maybe you've never told anyone? Just want to say, well, my dream job is to be a professor. That doesn't count.
That's certainly not a dream job.
I can attest to that.
It's actually my dream job, too. What?
Likewise, actually, I'm going to be.
Okay. Well, I've got a backup plan because I anticipated that I'd get that response. So imagine that your dream job is to create an encyclopedia. And you've got two options. You can get hired by one of the largest companies in the world, paid handsomely to do that. Or, you know, you're an entrepreneur, you don't want to go that route. You happen to live in, not in Silicon Valley, but in St. Petersburg, Florida. If you've ever been to St. Petersburg, Florida, you realize that it's a great place. There are not many entrepreneurs in St. Petersburg, Florida. So your choice is, if I stay in St. Pete and launch an encyclopedia, I'm going to have to find a way to do it without any money. I'm going to have to come up with a way to, you know, compete against the alternative, which is a heavily funded operation by a major company. Well, how do you do it? So with that, my company is called the K-Pop Group. About 9 months ago, I left a large law firm. The goal was simply to take a step away from the confines of the legal profession and work directly with companies where, you know, I have one-on-one interactions with them every day. What do you need? Here's what I can bring to the table. If you like what I have to offer, make me a partner in your enterprise, and we'll create something great together. So I help companies, organizations with green innovation, with developing concepts and projects from inception to market. And in this instance, large companies actually serve a very important role because ultimately you develop something, they're at least one alternative in terms of exit strategy. But the real goal is to create long-term sustainable value. So another way to say it is that I'm an SME that works primarily with other SMEs. Just for definitional sake, there are a lot of different definitions on what an SME is, but generally speaking, it's one that employs less than 100 people. It's been difficult to define in part, and it's been difficult to measure because of the informal nature of their activities. For that reason, CSR within an SME culture has been referred to as silent. The key question that we all ought to be asking ourselves, though, is, well, why would an SME participate in CSR activities? And Dan has already exhibited that point. To me, it's a silly notion. It must have been invented by a large company, because when you're a small and medium enterprise, you're typically a family-owned enterprise or a small business. You're embedded within that community, and reputation means everything. There's no need to be socially responsible that meets some sort of objective metric. You have to live it. You have to prove it. Yet why are we talking about them? In large part because they comprise 90% of all U.S. firms. Now, while large firms account for less than 1% of total firms, they also employ 50% of the U.S. population. In Europe, some estimates have suggested that SMEs contribute 50% to pollution. Compliance data is not clear, but the effectiveness of regulating these companies is also not clear. Nevertheless, there's been a very strong correlation between the amount of SMEs within a particular country and the strength of that country's GDP. It's unclear why, but it would suggest that having a strong middle class is very important. It would also suggest that there's a major opportunity here for sustainable development if we can promote more small and medium enterprises in countries. What this would also suggest, I would think, is that the higher your GDP, the higher the prevalence of SMEs within that country, you're perpetuating a cycle that you want to continue. Most importantly, and I'm going to get into some of the clients I work with now, SMEs are really that's where innovation is taking place. That's where Zipcars are realizing that there's a better way of doing things. McDonald's, Walmart, these were all SMEs at one point. But once you get to a certain size, unless there's a real commitment to R&D or undertaking pilots, innovation actually presents a risk that many corporate managers want to avoid. So what does it mean to go beyond compliance? We've talked about this. I just come at it from a very simplistic legal definition. At a minimum, it means complying with the law. But more broadly, it means being a good community or corporate citizen and implementing best practices within the social and environmental arena, whatever that means. So the central premises that I'd like to look at and discuss is that compliance mechanisms, this notion of compliance, at least as applied to SMEs, is really an outdated way of looking at things. We've talked about command and control within the environmental arena, carrots and sticks. What is it really that drives SMEs? And the question ought to be, what is it that drives us? Did we come out of the womb simply prepped to become the next CEO at Goldman Sachs that is going to engage in illegal or unethical behavior? I've got a kind of interesting viewpoint on that. My wife and I have two little boys, and what we want to promote, we're going through potty training. So we've devised what we think is this ingenious strategy that probably has disastrous long-term consequences. We're going to give him an M&M every time he successfully goes on the potty. He gets 2 if he goes number 2. Well, he's 2 years old. He's figured out that he can hold it and go 5 minutes later and get another M&M. So it's remarkable. He's 2 years old. He's already, now is he acting unethically? He's responding to an incentive that we've given him. It's been an incredible lesson for us. So at the end of the day, compliance is not really the goal. What we're looking at is optimal, sustainable performance. And that really the central premise is that SMEs are really the key to the sustainability kingdom. I'm going to sort of blow through this slide. When we're talking about compliance, I've just kind of categorized 3 different areas: environmental compliance, thou shalt not pollute; social workplace compliance, essentially you should treat your employees fairly, make sure that they have a safe place to work; and economic and tax compliance. This is a very broad category, but I've summed it up. You should pay your taxes. Well, SMEs, well, obviously, within an SME, environmental compliance might be a differentiator. You should buy our product as opposed to the product from this really large company. Agriculturally, that's a very good example. You've got feeding lots. Why would you buy these eggs when you can buy these farm-raised chickens that that were produced locally? Workplace. SMEs are motivated to take actions less by regulation and more so by reputation. If locally, within your community, you know that you've got numerous different options, you're going to migrate to the company that has a very good reputation for treating their employees well. And then, there was the example of, I think it was a bank that funds the Boys and Girls Club. Well, the question here was, so what? But that actually matters if you're a small local bank and you know the people that walk in and out of your door every day. So really what drives SME performance is people, much more so than in a large faceless company where you don't necessarily see or know who's managing you up the chain. More importantly, there's absence of a demand to meet short-term Wall Street earnings, and there's a much stronger component of just real human element and ambitions. So the question ought to be, well, what motivates us? And here's where I'm going to start plagiarizing, because it's far and away the best written description that I've seen as applied to why I'm doing what I've decided to do, why many of the clients that I'm working with are doing what they decided to do, and it comes back to the central premise. Money is not necessarily the end-all, be-all. Daniel Pink wrote this book called Drive. Has anybody read it? Highly, highly recommended. He's gone through, he's talked to scientists that have done extensive research that can prove this, but he sees in each of us really a strong human need for 3 things. And these 3 things are things that we would seek out when we look for finding employment, whether that's to become a professor or to start an encyclopedia. Those 3 things being autonomy, the opportunity for mastery, and lastly, purpose, something greater than serving something that's higher than ourselves. Certainly, these 3 things are largely what I would think promote entrepreneurialism. I would imagine that A, you're motivated by an opportunity to make money, but it's because you're also recognizing that society needs this service or this product that you're preparing to bring them. So a couple of case studies just to point out what this means. Hydros Coastal Solutions is a company founded by a friend of mine from high school that went on to get his PhD in microbiology. He's invented this product called Shorelock. It's a powder, you mix it with water, you apply it to the coastline, and it makes sand naturally stick to itself. Fascinating. It's completely non-toxic, environmentally safe. What it does is it apparently strengthens the naturally occurring hydrogen bonds between these particles. Huge marketplace in terms of preventing erosion and naturally growing a beach. Come to Florida, which is where I came up from, and I can tell you, this is something that everyone cares about. Well, if you're Troy, Dr. Scott, if he simply wanted to found a company that was going to manage or maintain contracts. There's a existing cadre of companies that what they do is they literally dredge sand and they spit it back up on the beach. And it's that's how it's been done. So you've got a new product that is significantly cheaper. It's it's 100% non-toxic. It's more cost-effective. This is a novel idea that probably would not have originated within one of these companies, because to do so would have meant sacrificing revenue. Unless you take a long-term view and recognize that this is a more effective way of doing things, and you would put your competitors out of business. So what was compliance in this respect is a differentiator. They want compliance. They want they want their competitors to have to comply with the same environmental standards that they do. But they were motivated to do this not by compliance, but because, for starters, each of the folks that got involved with this company never saw themselves working for a big corporation. They wanted autonomy. They wanted the freedom of self-direction to come up with a better way. So here are a couple of pictures. The one on the left is sort of the old way of doing business, and the way on the right is a beach that they treated, I want to say in the Bahamas. That could be another motivation. They saw an opportunity to go to the Bahamas frequently. This is another organization I work with. It's called Locally-Copia. This is a company that was founded by two managers at the Breakers Hotel. They're senior managers. They've been there forever. They want to seek to catalyze a shift towards consumption of locally sourced products, primarily food. They ask themselves, why is it easier and cheaper for me to get a mango from overseas than to get one from right here, right in South Florida? What's the breakdown? Well, is there a need for these folks to be thinking about compliance? Most of their members on the farming side are local organic farmers. Clearly, there are agricultural standards, there's environmental health and safety, but most of the regulations that exist to address ills that exist with large agricultural operations. So, the question here is, well, why? What's their motivation? I think it's represented, in the value and the quality of the food that they're serving their hotel and restaurant members. I work with another company called Carolina Solar Farms. Can kind of speed through this. The name says it all. They develop photovoltaic solar farms. How do they do it? Well, here in this instance, compliance is also a driver, because what they're doing is they're counting on the fact that utilities have to purchase a certain amount of renewable energy, and that in turn, that's what spawns and creates this market. But if you were to ask the founder, why are you doing this? He's got other things that he could be doing with his time, and it's heavily time intensive. The money's decent, but his real motivation is that we have to come up with a way to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. So he's motivated by that social purpose. Lastly, there's a company I work with called EcoCity Partners. What they do is they sponsor public-private partnerships with cities and counties. What they're seeking to do is to make it easier for homeowners, business owners to either invest in energy efficiency or renewable energy technology, and they do this through an innovative financing program called PACE. We partnered with a company out of California that invented this concept. It essentially involves working with your local government and assessment authority to pay for the upfront cost of installing this technology, and then repaying that financial mechanism, that assessment, typically over 20 years through your property taxes. It does two things. It ties the investment to the property, so that if you sell your house, you know that the subsequent owner is going to be in a position to assume that obligation. It runs with the property. It's not accelerated the way that a mortgage would be. The other thing that it does is it, by virtue of the fact that you've got a senior lien that's co-equal with local government tax lien, it's effective at lowering that interest rate, and in turn, you can finance these types of investments typically with a way that would result in actually saving money every month through the energy savings that you're realizing. It's been implemented primarily in California, also in Colorado. 23 states have passed legislation, and it's been proven, particularly important right now, to create jobs. The problem, I know we've talked a lot about Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae and their parent authority, the Federal Housing Finance Authority, has basically raised safety and soundness concerns. They're basically saying that by virtue of the fact that many of these PACE assessments have senior priority, that this constitutes a huge threat to the housing and specifically the secondary mortgage market. I don't know that I agree with that. It's their job to assess those risks. The sentiment has been, this is a knee-jerk reaction. We were asleep at the wheel during the last 5-10 years. We're now going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. It's been an overzealous response, according to many people. And the question is, well, how do you address whatever risks this market poses? Well, EcoCity partners and all the folks that work in this arena, well, they want compliance. Because compliance is going to help protect consumers, lenders, protect the market. Ultimately, their motivation is, to help move and develop an innovative financing tool. And to do that, they're motivated by, not only the freedom to do something a little bit different, but the opportunity to master a new field, and ultimately the social purpose. So, just the things that I've learned, both from listening to the sessions, over the course of the day, and to working with these clients, is really that compliance is, and the manner in which we're regulating, particularly small and middle enterprises, is outdated. That we ought not to think about forcing change. That we ought to think more about using the market instead of fighting it, and that ultimately, people, employees need to be thought of more as people that are motivated by real human ambitions that are not necessarily tied to the old Newtonian way of, if we pay them more, they'll work harder and do more things. When I say that they'll surprise you, if we think about it, not just these 4 clients, but when I tell you that the company I asked about at the beginning is Wikipedia, and they were competing with Microsoft and Carta, heavily funded. Wikipedia was, for the life of me, I still have no idea who is it that goes into Wikipedia and fills out information. But what I do know is that when I want to, I can go to Wikipedia, and it's a pretty satisfactory definition that's been created essentially by 350,000 volunteers. So if you completely disagree with everything that I've said about what is it that motivates people, I'd be really curious to hear what is it that motivates people to take some of their own time and to contribute, to the development of a company that they have no ownership or stake in. Because I'd be interested in your explanation as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess part of the theme is the whole past 2 days being like the line of what exactly is social responsibility. Or we don't have a true definition of what it is and what. So I'm wondering with Founding Farmers and Zipcar.
Zipcar.
But you work for you guys merged.
They
yeah. So I get there are a couple of examples I'm going to see. I'm just curious. So how do you define it, and where do you draw the line? With Founding Farmers, I think the Post did a little article about you a while ago, and you guys were something about, what you didn't have everything was locally grown in a particular menu section or organic. I don't remember the details, but there was something there, and you changed the menu. At the end, you ended up changing the menu. So where do you define the line, and how much of your, kind of has to be locally grown or organic? And for you, for Zipcar, I mean, you guys have to keep on producing. You guys, believe have to do new cars every
3 years.
3 years. I believe, even you can correct me if I'm wrong, part of the process, the biggest environmental waste is making a new car. How do you reconcile that with, that's way before the lifetime of the car ends, is that you're building a new car, you're buying a new car, you're creating a lot of, that means some car down the line is possibly going to the junkyard before its life cycle. Those may be wrong, those facts may be wrong, but so how do you reconcile like that, where's the line that you draw, and how do you define that, and how does that, basically where's the line that you draw, what?
I love these questions because I think that you at the heart of the matter of this whole topic is truth. We get a ton of credit in our business for transparency, and the difference between there's a very, very small difference between what we say and what we do. There is a gap there at any given day because what I do is a moving target, and I'm not able to verify every source of every product I buy fast enough to always know that I'm doing the right thing. We eventually figure it out. Specifically to speak to the Post article, I have a really long and emotional blog response on our blog about it. It sort of fits with my feeling about media in general. They did no fact checking. It was really pretty weak. Her attempt was to sort of find scandal where there wasn't one. Because local isn't core to our brand. I don't say that it's a sole source core to our brand. I say it's an important part of what we do. Like last summer, we bought probably 50,000 pounds of local produce. And that was probably a third of all the produce I used. So I make a huge impact on local farmers. And I have a huge carbon footprint from produce I buy from God knows where in some far-flung place. However, more important to me is who grew that produce. So we rank our priorities. Local is not my top priority. Buying from ideally family farmers or smaller productions and avoiding institutional and corporate farming is a much higher priority. But holistically, I care about the planet, so we buy carbon offsets. So we have, if you look at any of our individual actions and sort of slice them, you can find something I do that you could say, hey, does that align with your mission? My thing is you have to look at everything we do because it's in balance, and you have to look at everything we do compared to our competition because we are way ahead. So for me, the reconciling is just look at it all. It's this, minus this, plus this, minus this, plus this, minus this, 2 goods, 1 bad, 2 good. But the reality is the world doesn't need another restaurant. I'm going to build a restaurant company, and I'm going to do construction, and the world, it's just the last thing the world needs is another restaurant. But I'm going to make a lot of money, and that's my job. That's what I want to do, is make money, and I'm going to be a great employer. So every restaurant I open, I'll have 100 new employees. We teach English classes. We do Welcome to America. We're a nice place to work. I probably have some employees who hate it, think it sucks. That's like, but so I would reconcile all of that by saying it's the whole picture, and the answer is in the questioner needs to dig really deep. You gotta keep going. So I'm interested in Elise's perspective too, because I'm sure it's thought through, and there must be some of that, but that would be my feeling on it. And I think it's a super question, and you get the more questions you ask, the more questions the consumer asks, the better companies have to be. The more you got to walk your talk or educate on why that walk isn't possible right now due to some other factor. So I love the dialogue.
Thank you for the question. It's also interesting for us as well, like to reiterate what Dan's saying, to hear feedback from our customers, from our members, just from everyone out there. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and all those good things, which is scary, obviously, because there is instantaneous feedback and not always positive, but it's obviously a great way to hear from our customers, hear from our members. So to answer your question, the overarching goal is to reduce car ownership. It's to make urban life a lot less car dependent. And so the way that we do that is by having our cars be clean and accessible. Who are the Zipcar members around here again? Okay, so they're clean. They're cleaned every 9 days, 7 days actually today during this time frame because there's higher utilization during the summer. They're cleaned every 9 days. They're brand new. We actually refreshed our fleet this summer. So out of the 800 cars that we have in the DC area, we have 500 new ones. Did you guys notice that? All new cars that have like 0 to 3,000 miles right now. But in doing so, the trickle-down effect is that more and more people are actually selling and donating their cars, which makes maybe those older cars get to the junkyards that much faster. And those older cars are the ones that are polluting. So the ones that we have, you know, it's interesting, sometimes people will say to us, well, how come you don't have all hybrids? That would be a very big statement for 800 cars to be all hybrids. Well, the reality is that the consumers, the ones that are out there using the service, they don't want all hybrids, right? Sometimes you want to drive a BMW to take on your date. Sometimes you need to take a pickup to IKEA to go purchase your big piece of furniture. And so we need the diversity. We have about 25 different makes and models of cars that we offer for our members. And that diversity actually encourages more people to sell and donate their cars every day. So we do car donation programs a couple times a year. The last one we did with NPR, WAMU, the affiliate, was we got 150 cars donated in a month. That's a lot of cars. That's actually 400% more than they are normally getting in an average monthly program like that. So, and we don't get all Zipcar, all of those 150 donations didn't result in more Zipcar members, but it definitely resulted in cars off of the public streets of the DC metro area. And so ultimately, actually, and so the Washington Examiner reported earlier last year that all the while the DC population is increasing, the number of registered cars is decreasing. And so we're certainly happy about those statistics finally being, you know, netting from all of our efforts, because people are walking more and people are biking more. The bike sharing program, the metro, the buses, the circulator, all of these things contribute to having a more less car-dependent environment that we're working to create. So it's you know, to Dan's point, there's so many different aspects of it, and you know, but it's a very good question, and you know, certainly something that we can take back to our fleet team to say, well, what are we doing to make sure that the folks that we're leasing the cars from are actually, you know, doing things in a more sustainable way, just all the way through the supply chain.
Can I offer two quick observations? One is on this local question. Sometimes the calculus is almost impossible. My guess is people don't really know what it is, and it's going to vary. It's going to vary a lot by the geography, agricultural product. I saw something that was pretty interesting about. I think it was this was in the UK. Flowers to the UK. Actually, flowers flown in from, I can't remember, one of the African countries, but flowers flown in had a much smaller footprint than the flowers that would have come over from Holland. That's because the greenhouses in Holland during the winter have this huge need for energy to keep the greenhouses warm. So, you know, the local source isn't necessarily always going to be your, you know.
I mean, I wasn't trying to say that.
No.
Where do you calculate, like, you know, you have company emission and how do you, so it's
well,
not all fits in that.
So I think you get these things, okay, how big a value is local? You've made the statement, it's not the be all and end all. But sometimes the calculations are really tough to make, and sometimes the standards you set, if you want local, that's a great standard. That doesn't necessarily get you the best metric on all the scales against which you measure. So that's what. As for the Zipcar, you say BMW. I don't know if it's still true, but there was a while there where BMW wasn't meeting EPA fuel economy standards. So they were basically, as a cost of business, paying the fine. So they were out of compliance. So part of the cost of business for BMW was paying the fine. So you know, if someone were nasty, they'd come into the store, why is Zipcar use BW? You know, so you get these potential competing aspects whenever you're trying to be responsible. And people make their judgments, and I think you said we try and be as transparent as possible about what our judgments are. Here's what we're trying to do.
You know what's cool about it is, I think the people who are passionate about the planet or about the way workers are treated, or kind of one of these topics. What's awesome, it's really hard for me as the business owner, but what I love is I don't get compared to the other restaurants. I get compared to this like utopian benchmark, and it's crazy frustrating for me because I'm thinking you're picking on me, not you, but like you want to know why I don't why am I not totally local, let's just say, or why am I not these things, or why am I, and it's like, compare me to my competition. That's what I say. But I don't. I try to just bite my tongue, and I actually think what you think. Like, I care more about the consumer perspective than the business perspective. I just happen to be the guy behind the business. So it's a real challenge because someone could say, like, Zipcar, I would imagine that the math seems good. There's a whole bunch of, but I think your question, I thought, like, when you asked that, I thought to myself, yeah. And then, but really, I should be like, why shouldn't I be comparing you to Hertz or Ford, or those companies that are fucking doing nothing to help us? So it's an interesting dynamic, but I would say, push that. Because if we get to grade ourselves on the curve, look, I'm better than, my restaurant is way greener than the majority of my competitors in the national scape. I love the other DC restaurateurs. But, then I could like sit back a little, and say like, oh, we're grading on a curve. So keep pushing with those questions. But no, emotionally, the people behind the business are sometimes thinking like, God, could we get some props here? Because we are doing more.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Than is the norm. But I do love it because it makes us better. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, sir.
I do, and it's kind of a follow-up to one that I asked earlier. The general theme of these last 2 days has left me with two big questions. One, what are the drivers and who are the players in CSR, and kind of wrapping our heads around the entire definition of it. And then two, what do we do about it? How do we make, mandate, incentivize whatever CSR, or OSR, as John put it, so that it permeates everything? And to figure out solutions, it's first identifying the challenges. And John, I asked you earlier, and I think Tom, actually, you said it better just now. I asked, at what point does the consumer have a responsibility to do X, Y, and Z? And then Tom said, in one of your slides, or something along the lines of, is the challenge to change business habits, or is it to change consumer habits? And I kind of posed that, and your response was, well, it's businesses. It's business has more resources, and then don't they therefore have the obligation to educate the less educated consumer, to lift them up to this level? And I don't know if I'm entirely on board with that, because this is kind of an example of the fact that as consumers, whether through their own right or not, continue to become educated, capitalism will do what it does best, which is give the consumers what they're asking for. And that's why these guys are all successful. So is it all of our responsibility?
I guess my view is I always like to challenge false dichotomies, which is it the corporate world or is it the consumer? I don't think it's an either-or question. It's a both and. So that's one way, and I simply am making the observation that I think as people look at sometimes appointed corporations, they need to be mindful of the role consumers play and how corporations behave, particularly corporations that deal every day with the customer. His customers want local, and they start beating up on him. He's either going to do that, he's going to tell them no can do, they may go away, but I mean, if people were telling Ford, I want more energy efficient vehicles and get rid of the big stuff, I believe, I don't have any facts, Ford would have moved that direction.
And by the way, it's not what the consumer says, it's what the consumer does.
Well, that's what I said.
What they buy. Let's address your question with a survey. How many people here are boycotting BP?
stations really in DC, so if I
I
keep
don't
that.
call it, but I would, if I had
You
to,
would if you had
I
it.
would boycott.
How about Target?
Well, the reason I say
Boycotting Target.
the reason I say BP is because in Florida, I bet the percentage would be a heck of a lot higher, because we're seeing that, you know, down where we live. We realize the impact of that unethical behavior.
You got one of the largest gay populations in Greater Washington. I think there are a lot of gay people that are offended by Target's political contributions, and you could make the argument that you might see some of the biggest boycotting behavior in a market like San Francisco or New York or Washington for the same reason, local impact on behavior.
I want to take it away from consumer demand, and I want to bring it back to the business. I get it that you want to sleep at night. I get it that you want to be able to offer a product that hasn't been offered. How does that help you manage, or how does that help you think differently? So I've got the examples from the sand and the technology with the microbiologists with the sand. That was great, Mike. And I've got the new markets, Tom, that you created with energy markets. So I guess I'm looking at Dan and Elise, and I'm thinking of past conversations. How did you think differently about waste and composting? I know we've had that part of that conversation. I don't know where it is now, but how has that changed what you do?
Yeah, we actually, like, I think, we think differently about everything.
Right.
You know, because of it, like this stance. So it's in the DNA of the business, but, you know, we're still people behind the business, you know, so we have to figure out how we think. And we've just created a decision-making metric to really define our stakeholders in a little bit broader way than I was raised in the business world to define them. I mean, I went to GW, but I didn't learn these things at GW. I mean, it was a long time ago, you know, at least the classes I remember, which is my own memory issue, not a knock on GW. You know, like, so the stakeholders now, to me, like, I also consider the families of my employees as stakeholders in my business. That's new thinking. And so when we train managers to write schedules for the staff, we have, like, you don't just get, like, what's your availability? Now it's like, what's your availability and why? So our managers have to know, like, this person needs to be off at work at 4 o'clock because they have to pick up their kids. This person has to be off at work at 4 o'clock because they coach soccer. This is, and what we train the managers is, the managers are like, I need you to work this day, because the managers have to survive a restaurant shift. But we reward the managers when the staff has a higher level of satisfaction in the job, and we've learned that if we teach the managers, like, the staff will have a higher satisfaction in the job. If you can balance, you think you need them to work, they need to pick up their kid at daycare, and every minute they're late, they have to pay $5, or, you know, whatever that is. So we try to see the business now through this lens of, it's not just the employees, it's their family. It's not just, you know what I mean? And so there's it's not just this stakeholder, it's the further path of that. So we do, I mean, honestly, I could give a 3-hour dialogue about all of our initiatives that would fall under this umbrella of, you know, sort of socially responsible stuff. And I would tell you, we get an enormous return on it. And the business is, you know, more successful by all measures because of it. The business could be run, I could probably take 4 points of more profit starting tomorrow if I stopped doing this stuff, but I would shorten the life of my business. And I know that. So I know where we'll be in year 10 and year 20 because of what we do, those specific things. And so we have a forecasted value as opposed to just, you know, this quarter's results. But that's cool.
It's an interesting question. You know, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it. We also think about the way on the back end of the Zipcar system. Anytime you contact us, we have a record of it. It's what's called a ticket. And so anytime you call us about low gas or dirty car or late anything, we have a ticket. And we have a goal of responding to all members all of our 500,000 members within 24 hours. And so one of the things that we started to do is start to not manage by tickets, but rather manage the members, realizing the fact that there are people behind these things. And so when you're angry about the bill because you were late and you got a $50 late fee, we don't then just send out the standard template and send it off. You know, the idea is to think more about the individual behind the person that's contacting us here. And the fact that, you know, some people are having bad days when they're contacting us, and, you know, all of those things come into play, obviously. You know, it's interesting, though, because, you know, we keep talking about how it's a part of your DNA as a company. And it's certainly something that, you know, you see companies that have maybe a CSR department or a green manager or a green department, and then they work diligently to get infiltrated throughout all the different product lines or departments within the company, and obviously that is not as well received as one would like. But for us, it's everyone's responsibility, and it's something that, you know, we review our values once every couple of weeks. One value, we have, you know, 4 main principal values, and we'll review them, you know, one every couple of weeks and see how we're doing. And we're not perfect, so then we try to figure out, well, what do we do to get better at those kinds of things? But, you know, the one thing that I always try to impress upon my team is that it's not my job to make us, you know, greener or more efficient team or more accountable to one another. It's everyone's job. And so when someone comes to me and says, hey, you didn't put that in the recycling bin, that's what should be happening. Or someone comes to another teammate to say, hey, you need to be working hard because I'm working hard. That's what we're trying to create at Zipcar. So it's not just whenever the big boss walks in, hey, you know, step up your game. It's a teamwork collaboration, knowing that there are people behind everything.
You know, my employees hammer me. And I mean, like, I walk into work and they're like, you know, why we're out of the compostable straws and we just have the plastic straws, and this is, you know, it's a total affront. Like, they're personally offended because we attract a lot of employees who care. And I mean, they just, like, it's a safe environment we work in, so anybody can say anything at any time, and it's brutal for me because I'm just like, you know, like, it's a company. We're never perfect. We constantly, but what you just said sort of made me think that if you can build a company culture, so you strive to do this, and then a lot of times you deliver, and then you slip. Like right now, we're trying to switch to, we have these plastic, fully recycled straws, and some straws are recyclable and some aren't recyclable. But the ones that are recyclable come from, like, God knows where, and then we found out that the chemicals used to make them are, like, worse. So now we're trying to switch to paper straws, which used to be made in the U.S. and now aren't made in the U.S. anymore because of the manufacturing costs. So there's a lot of these topics that the businesses are driven to do that we need more resources. And I've had some great success in our company with, so I push back at that employee. If you care so much, go get me the answer. And our staff is awesome. They're like, I will. And, you know, they come back and they're like, here's this and here's that. So I think when you can create a dynamic like that of everybody's on the same team, you know, you're working towards the result. You know, like for us, we fight the city. Because for us, the city's not responsive. They don't get composting. They don't get recycling. They don't get a whole bunch of things. I just sent a check for $10,000 to the city because for the ballpark fee. So I hope you go to a lot of baseball games because I just paid 10 grand for that stadium. So there's a lot. These details get so, like, if I didn't have to spend the 10 grand on the ballpark fee, which by the way I'm actually fine with, maybe I could have
just not the team.
The team. If the team would win, the economy would do better, and then I would do So anyways, again, deep. You've gotta, like, if there's a takeaway from this, I would say on these issues, it's a real shortcut to stay on the surface. And when you're passionate about this stuff, really, really learn about it. Ask the questions. It is not simple. And it's not just environmental or employee relations or blah, blah, blah. It's just not simple. And a lot of the passion and the vehemence you hear about these sorts of topics stay on the surface. Like, I can't believe you buy fish from that fish farm. It's like, well, did you know that Whole Foods sells fish from that fish farm? Like, did you know that maybe there's a whole debate that fish farming is good versus, and then, you know, maybe the science is gray. So I would say, you know, dig really deep and fuel your passion with the facts.
I It is a personal point of view. I did was responsible for the social practices, the corporate practices, environmental practices at the previous company. And so one of the things you're constantly trying to do is figure out which of the activities you have the resources to engage in and what just don't you have time for. So you always try, there's some hierarchy about what matters and what doesn't. I'm impressed you're thinking about compostable straws. I mean, I think I'm actively hostile to perfectionism in the CSR world. I think it's wrong-headed. I think it leads to all kinds of bad outcomes. You just can't be, as you say. So I think in these matters, to some extent, you got to look at, you know, where are the major consequences? And I gotta go after that stuff first. And insofar as you can figure it out, you move down the line. Now, if you're at the point where you guys are in dispute over compostable straws, you're doing really well.
Thank you.
I mean, seriously, you think of all the things that are having deleterious effects. That's got to be pretty far down the line.
Yeah, it is.
Take one more, yes, sir.
Yeah, as I listen to you speaking, I can close my eyes and what I hear is a non-profit where the passion runs deep and the need for other rewards is not as great. So a question for you. One, does your size afford you an advantage in terms of being socially responsible? Or if you want to look at the opposite way, if you were 10 times the size you are right now, could you be doing what you are doing in the way you are doing it? Because communication lines will be strained. I can't come in and yell at you because I'm 200 miles away. And not only that, you may not be able to hire all the people who share the passion that you have.
So for sure, it would be much more difficult, because if you go back to what I said, and I said tomorrow, I could change some of our practices and I could pick up 4 new points of profit. Well, we do, between our 2 restaurants, about $16 million a year in sales. If we were doing $160 million a year in sales, and I could pick up 4 new points of profit, that is a much tougher conversation to have. So, right, because what am
You focused on the profits. I did not. I'm not focusing on the profits at all in that question.
Oh, okay.
My question was not about profits at all.
Oh, okay.
Not at all.
Okay, so, sorry, I misinterpreted that. So, if we were a larger company, would we still
maintain the same level of passion and commitment of your employees to the ideals that you're pushing and keeping the communication lines open that you have expressed repeatedly?
Oh yeah, I do. I think that's actually simple. I think that today with social media, we have a blog that we're setting up for our staff right now. Our staff, like, I broadcast messages to our staff through the scheduling software. They can instantly respond. My broadcast messages go to most of their cell phones. And so when I say that I get hammered by the staff, I realize the example I gave was I walked through the front door, but I'll go 3 weeks and not step foot into one of the restaurants if I'm away or we have another project somewhere. And the volume of feedback is relentless via social media forums. So I can't hide from the guests. We've averaged on Yelp.com 1 review per day for 2 years straight. So I think as we grow as a company, I'll need to expand our ability to absorb that, but I don't think that there'll be any less. And I actually created a job to handle the dialogue so we could hear it all and not just have it hit our radar. So no, on understanding your specific question, I have no concern about that, except for the specific thing you said of will we always be able to retain this caliber employee. Depends how big we grow the company. In our industry, like my philosophy, if I had more than 100 restaurants, I'd be kind of full of shit. Like, you just reach a point where you become a corporate monster.
That gives you a little room to grow.
Yeah, look, I got 98 to go. So there's some line at which you're just a corporate behemoth, and you kind of got to hire them, as many as you can, and the magic is lost, and you don't attract the caliber that you get. I will have sold out.
But is your question, just so I want to make sure, your question, as his company grows, any of these companies grow, the increasing difficulty in finding colleagues who will share values.
The same philosophy and values.
Yeah, my quick reaction is no. Being out in the world hiring, there's an awful lot of people who are looking for what I would characterize as meaningful work and work that's kind of consistent with their values. So I think finding good, capable people is not the challenge. I think it might be a little bit more. The bigger you get, the more kind of attitude you're going to have about what's important. So managing how you decide which you're going to do might get a little tougher.
It's just hard to make a case in our specific brand. If we really started stamping out restaurant after restaurant, I think that would blow a bit of a hole in the authenticity
well,
of it.
Well, the broader question I was just trying to ask, which could be asked of all of you, and that is, does size, i.e. being smaller, afford an organization an advantage in social responsibility? That was the real heart of the question.
Oh, probably yes.
I think it does. An advantage, but it's not necessarily, as long as you build that culture, whether it's through interpersonal relationships or through the other mechanisms at your disposal. If you ever talk to an employee of the company interface, you'll realize that culture permeates that entire company.
I think it allows you to walk before you run. You know, so if the small company can pay a lot of attention to passion and the energy, and you know, for Zipcar we have almost 500,000 people that are our members, and they're always excited when we post a job opening. There's a ton of Zipcar members that want to come work for us, and that's a phenomenal place to be. And so if the purpose of the company is something that others identify with, it's really bringing those people in on the team to continue to permeate through the rest.
It'll be interesting as this generation's company that have come up with this and have it in their DNA become big. I think the answer that we may see is, if we always tell the truth to our investors and we have our cost of being socially responsible factored into our promises, then I think we will have a much easier time than the established companies who have promised X margin as public companies now try to do stuff that might cost them a bit more money. They're slightly buggered with that conflict. So, I don't know, I think there's maybe some interest there as we all go forward.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
And this actually marks the end of the 2-day experiment. I guess I should call it a pilot. Is that right, Tom? That it's not an experiment, but it's a 2-day pilot. The 5th in a series, what we did this time was, rather than having our small 20 little folk, researchers, academics sitting in a room literally just up the way, we opened the door, brought in some executives, brought in some other executives, brought in NGOs, brought in some multilaterals, brought in some government agencies, and had a rather robust but very different conversations than if you're just looking at businesses or just looking at government or just looking at multilaterals and NGOs. So if you start putting two of them together, business and public policy, or business and government, or business and multilaterals, or multilaterals and public-private partnerships, that's different. But I think what we did today, or these last 2 days, and thank you for joining us and staying with us through this, is by adding the third component, by having business as well as government and regulations, but also what are the demands from not just your employees, but the employees of the families, or what is it that you're trying to create with carbon markets, or what is it that you're trying to create by stopping erosion, or what is it that you're trying to do that might have these social issues or civil society sort of impacts. But by adding that third circle, it's not additive. It's actually exponentially more complex. Might be long-term more satisfying and more effective, but it's a different way of thinking and managing. I haven't got an answer at all. I have gazillions, far more questions, thanks to you all. But I think it's just a pilot. So I don't know what pilot 2.0 is going to be next year or next month, but thank you all for being here.